What is a young boy to do when he lifts up his eyes and finds out that he's the property of another person? Does he simply accept his fate, or does he do something to change it? This was the predicament in which the great role model, abolitionist, and speaker Frederick Douglass found himself in when he was a child. This is many, many years before he finally escaped the vicious jaws of slavery. Now, the story that he tells from his 1855 autobiography titled My Bondage and My Freedom begins with an introduction to his childhood in Tuckahoe, Maryland. Now, he didn't know where he was born, and on top of that, he didn't know his actual age either. In fact, he states that he never knew a slave that could tell him their actual age. And that's because the masters would not allow these type of questions to be asked. Keeping the slave ignorant was one of the primary goals of the masters, which Douglass mentions numerous times in his story. Now, in his earliest years, he was raised by his grandparents, particularly his grandmother, Betty, which he loved dearly, right? They stayed in in a log cabin, which was separated at a distance from the rest of the slave quarters. Now, the question is, why was Mr. Douglass brought up by his grandparents? Here's his explanation. The practice of separating children from their mother and hiring the latter out at distances too great to admit of their meeting, except at long intervals, is a marked feature of the cruelty and barbarity of the slave system. But it is in harmony with the grand aim of slavery, which, always and everywhere, is to reduce man to a level with the brute. The slave masters did everything in their power to transform their humanhood into beasthood, right? That's what he's talking about. And one of the ways of doing that was to remove the child from its mother. Now, he's going to address the fathers in a little bit, but here's what else he writes. It is a successful method of obliterating from the mind and heart of the slave all just ideas of the sacredness of the family as an institution. He said it is a successful method, which means that the actions of the slave master were effective in producing the results of destroying the mind, mentality, and the makeup of the family, of those that they enslaved. And this is something that he knew better than anyone else, because this is what they did to him, right? You're going to see as we continue going. This is exactly what they did to him. Now, as a very young child, he says he initially didn't know that he was a slave. He just lived what seemed to him to be a regular, ordinary life of being outside, playing with all the other children that his grandparents were also raising. He learned his fate over time in degrees. The first degree was him discovering that the cabin that they lived in was not owned by his grandparents, but it was owned by some man who lived a distance away, who grandma called Old Master, right? And in addition to this, it was not only the little cabin that this Old Master owned, he also owned all the little children that he was outside playing with. And it doesn't stop there. He didn't just own them. He also owned grandma herself, right? This is what he's figuring out. Now, Old Master didn't own grandpa, right? For grandpa was a physically free man, right? So we couldn't get him. Now, what young Douglass also found out was that this mysterious figure named Old Master only allowed children to live with Grandma Betty for a limited time. Then afterwards, he comes to take them away, right? And although Douglass was too young to fully comprehend the extent of this situation, he was left haunted by the idea of what was to come, right? Old Master played a terrifying role in his imagination, just like the boogeyman, the devil, the Candyman, and Bloody Mary does in many young children today. But the difference was, this boogeyman had actual flesh and bones, which young Douglass was soon to find out about as his departure came from his grandmother's house. Now, let's hear some of Mr. Douglass's realizations at this point. Here we go. I was a slave, born a slave, and though the fact was incomprehensible to me, it conveyed to my mind a sense of my entire dependence on the will of somebody I had never seen. And from some cause or other, I had been made to fear this somebody above all else on earth. Born for another's benefit, as the firstling of the cabin flock, I was soon to be selected as a meat offering to the fearful and inexorable demigod,
whose huge image on so many occasions haunted my childhood's imagination. When the time of my departure was decided upon, my grandmother, knowing my fears, and in pity for them, kindly kept me ignorant of the dreaded event about to transpire. Up to the morning, a beautiful summer morning, when we were to start, and indeed, during the whole journey, a journey which, child as I was, I remember as well as if it were yesterday, she kept the sad fact hidden from me. This reserve was necessary, for could I have known all, I should have given grandmother some trouble in getting me started. As it was, I was helpless, and she, dear woman, led me along by the hand, resisting with the reserve and solemnity of a priestess all my inquiring looks to the last.
So Grandma walked him some distance to the plantation, all while keeping to herself what was about to happen to him. Now, this had to be an extremely devastating event for her, but just like many other enslaved women, she had to remain super strong in a situation that she had no control over, right? Now, as they arrived at the plantation, he was surprised to see how many children were outside playing. And out of those children, he learned from his grandmother that a few of them were his brothers and sisters, which he had never seen before, right? Now, he really didn't know what to make of it since these people were strangers and distant people to him. But I want you to listen to some of his thoughts here.
Brothers and sisters we were by blood, but slavery had made us strangers. I heard the words brother and sisters and knew they must mean something, but slavery had robbed these terms of their true meaning. My poor mother, like many other slave women, had many children, but no family.
Remember, he told us in the beginning that one of the great aims of slavery was to ruin the family. Now you're seeing another instance of how his family was ruined, right? This is how they ruined it. He was robbed from the experience of developing an attachment to his siblings. And he really didn't understand what that was like, right? Now, while he was standing there in a daze and watching the children play and being enticed by the children to come and play, he really did not know how to respond to the situation, right? He was still dazed, right? This is all new to him. And his grandmother was encouraging him to go to the back of the house to go and play, right? Which he eventually did. He didn't go play, but he eventually went to the back of the house. And when he went back there, he just leaned against the wall and felt a sense of uncertainty in the situation. And after being there for some time, one of the kids came over to him and they told him, hey, Grandma left. And in disbelief, he went to go and look for himself. And with his own pair of eyes, this is what he saw.
Grandmammy had indeed gone and was now far away, clean out of sight. I need not tell all that happened now. Almost heartbroken at the discovery, I fell upon the ground and wept a boy's bitter tears, refusing to be comforted. My brother and sisters came around me and said, "Don't cry," and gave me peaches and pears. But I flung them away and refused all their kindly advances. I had never been deceived before, and I felt not only grieved at parting, as I suppose forever with my grandmother, but indignant that a trick had been played upon me in a matter so serious.
This jacked him up, just like it would have jacked anyone else up who found themselves in this situation. Can you imagine being a kid getting dropped off in a strange land around a whole bunch of people that you've never met before, you don't know anything about, right? And you're the only one just left there, feel like you're deserted. This is what he's feeling right now and what he's experiencing, right? Think about that. Think of how tragic this was. Now, from here, let's deal with another missing link in Frederick's life, right? Which was his father. To him, his father was this grand mystery. And here he's going to explain why.
Slavery does away with fathers as it does away with families. Slavery has no use for either fathers or families, and its laws do not recognize their existence in the social arrangements of the plantation. When they do exist, they are not the outgrowths of slavery, but are antagonistic to that system. The order of civilization is reversed here. The name of the child is not expected to be that of its father, and his condition does not necessarily affect that of the child. He may be the slave of Mr. Tilghman, and his child, when born, may be the slave of Mr. Gross. He may be a freeman, and yet his child may be a chattel. He may be white, glorying in the purity of his Anglo-Saxon blood, and his child may be ranked with the blackest slaves. Indeed, he may be, and often is, master and father to the same child. He can be father without being a husband, and may sell his child without incurring reproach, if the child be by a woman in whose veins courses 1/32nd part of African blood. My father was a white man, or nearly white. It was sometimes whispered that my master was my father.
This was why his father was such a mystery to him. The English colonists and their later descendants, called white Americans, designed the slave system to ruin families by getting rid of the fathers, right? And because of that, Mr. Douglass didn't know with certainty if his father was also his master or not, right? Now, on top of that, he was also quite unfamiliar with his mother. And that's because she had to give him up to Grandma Betty when he was an infant. And she needed to do that so she could return to work in the field, right? This is how they had it set up. Now, he says that she never visited him at Grandma Betty's house. The only time he remembers seeing her is when he made the transition over to Old Master's plantation. From there, every so often, she would travel about 12 miles to come and see him briefly, right? And that's because she didn't have much time being a field hand to stay for extended periods. Now, what I want you to do right now is listen to this account that he details about one of his mother's visitations. Here we go.
I had on that day offended Aunt Katy, called Aunt by way of respect, the cook of Old Master's establishment.
A mean and nasty lady, one who was numbered with the slaves. She didn't like Frederick, so this is what she did to him.
I do not now remember the nature of my offense in this instance, for my offenses were numerous in that quarter, greatly depending, however, upon the mood of Aunt Katy as to their heinousness. But she had adopted that day her favorite mode of punishing me, namely making me go without food all day, that is, from after breakfast.
Now, what kind of person would starve a kid as a form of punishment? I know, a mean, nasty lady named Aunt Katy.
The first hour or two after dinner, I succeeded pretty well in keeping up my spirits. But though I made an excellent stand against the foe and fought bravely during the afternoon, I knew I must be conquered at last, unless I got the accustomed reinforcement of a slice of cornbread at sundown. Sundown came, but no bread, and, in its stead, there came the threat, with a scowl well suited to its terrible import, that she meant to starve the life out of me. Brandishing her knife, she chopped off the heavy slices for the other children, and put the loaf away, muttering all the while her savage designs upon myself. Against this disappointment, for I was expecting that her heart would relent at last, I made an extra effort to maintain my dignity, but when I saw all the other children around me with merry and satisfied faces, I could stand it no longer. I went out behind the house and cried like a fine fellow. And now, dear reader, a scene occurred which was altogether worth beholding, and to me it was instructive as well as interesting. The friendless and hungry boy, in his extremest need, and when he did not dare to look for succor, found himself in the strong, protecting arms of a mother who was, at the moment, being endowed with high powers of manner as well as matter, more than a match for all his enemies. I shall never forget the indescribable expression of her countenance when I told her that I had had no food since morning, and that Aunt Katy said she meant to starve the life out of me. There was pity in her glance at me, and a fiery indignation at Aunt Katy at the same time, and, while she took the corn from me and gave me a large ginger cake, in its stead, she read Aunt Katy a lecture which she never forgot. My mother threatened her with complaining to Old Master in my behalf, for the latter, though harsh and cruel himself, at times did not sanction the meanness, injustice, partiality, and oppressions enacted by Aunt Katy in the kitchen. That night I learned the fact that I was not only a child, but somebody's child.
What a memorable moment for a young boy, especially in a moment where it surely must have appeared that nobody in the world had his back. To just know that there was at least one person who actually cared, this must have been a huge deal for him, right? It must have been a huge deal. Now, shortly afterwards, his mother ended up giving up the ghost. And what he learned was that she was the only person with the brown skin, who they called black, who was able to read in the entire Tuckahoe district. And Frederick attributes his later developed passion for reading and learning to the genes, or maybe what he would say, the spirit passed from his mother on to him, right? Being that she was a field hand and she still figured out a way to learn how to read, which was extraordinarily impressive for that time period and for her situation, right? Now, up until this point right now, we've only scratched the surface of Mr. Douglass's life, and there's still a whole lot more to cover. In the next commentary, what we're going to go over is we're going to get a glimpse of how the plantation works as a system, right? As described by Mr. Douglass himself, right? And we're also going to see the use of the whip, right? You're definitely going to want to stay tuned to this, right? Very important stuff, very dramatic stuff that's getting ready to come up, right? Now, right now, what I want to do is I want to thank you for watching all the way into the end in this commentary. My name is Brooklyn St. Michael, and I'll see you in the free world.